The salt spray had frozen against the railings by the time Korvettenkapitän Heinrich Müller stepped onto the flight deck of the USS Shangri-La. It was the morning of May 23rd, 1945, and the war in Europe had been over for exactly 15 days. Müller had commanded U-boats in the Atlantic for 3 years, had sent Allied tonnage to the bottom with methodical precision, and had survived when so many of his fellow submariners had not. But nothing in his training, nothing in the carefully constructed world view fed to him by the Kriegsmarine's intelligence officers, had prepared him for what he was about to see. The American officer escorting him, a young lieutenant commander whose name Müller would later forget, gestured casually across the vast expanse of the flight deck. "She can carry 90 aircraft," the American said, almost apologetically, as if embarrassed by the excess. "Though we usually run with about 100 when we're really pushing it." Müller stopped walking. He had misunderstood, surely. His English was functional but imperfect. 90? He repeated. "Give or take," the American replied. "Depends on the mix. More fighters, fewer torpedo bombers. You can squeeze in a few extra." If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. For 3 years, German naval intelligence had assured Müller and thousands of officers like him that American carriers were impressive but manageable threats. The report spoke of 30, perhaps 40 aircraft per vessel. The German carriers that never quite materialized, the Graf Zeppelin that never saw combat, the planned vessels that remained as blueprints and broken promises, those were supposed to carry 42 aircraft. That number had seemed reasonable, even ambitious. 42 aircraft represented a significant investment in pilots, maintenance crews, fuel, and ordnance. It was the kind of number that reflected serious industrial commitment. 90 was something else entirely. 90 was not an incremental improvement. It was not the kind of advantage that could be overcome with superior tactics or better trained pilots. 90 aircraft on a single vessel represented a fundamental difference in how two nations understood naval warfare, industrial capacity, and the very nature of modern conflict. To understand why this moment shattered Müller's conception of the war, we must first understand what he had been told, what he had believed, and why those beliefs had seemed so reasonable for so long. When Heinrich Müller entered the Kriegsmarine in 1937, Germany's naval strategy was still anchored in the lessons of the First World War. The Battle of Jutland in 1916 had taught a generation of German naval officers that surface engagements between battle fleets would decide maritime supremacy. Aircraft carriers existed in this world view, but as reconnaissance platforms and fleet support, not as the primary striking arm of naval power. The battleship remained king, and the carrier was at best a useful auxiliary. This was not unreasonable thinking in the mid-1930s. The aircraft carrier was still a relatively new weapon system. The Royal Navy's early carriers were converted battle cruisers with wooden flight decks. The Japanese, despite their later reputation for carrier warfare, had in 1937 not yet committed to the carrier-centric doctrine that would define their early war successes. Even the United States Navy, which would eventually build more carriers than all other nations combined, was in 1937 still debating the proper role of carrier aviation within the fleet. German intelligence officers studied foreign carriers with professional interest but without alarm. The British Ark Royal, launched in 1937, could carry 60 aircraft, an impressive number, but one that seemed to reflect Britain's global colonial commitments rather than a revolutionary approach to naval warfare. The American carriers Lexington and Saratoga, converted from battlecruiser hulls, carried similar numbers. These were large ships, certainly, but they were also conversions, making use of hulls originally designed for different purposes. What German intelligence consistently underestimated was not the current state of American carrier development, but the speed and scale at which American industry could expand that capability. In 1937, the United States had 5 carriers in commission. By 1941, when Germany's war with Britain and the Soviet Union had already consumed enormous resources, America had 7. These numbers seemed to confirm German assumptions about the pace of naval construction. Building carriers was difficult, time-consuming work. Hulls had to be laid down, armor installed, propulsion systems integrated, flight decks constructed. Even the wealthy, industrially advanced United States appeared to be adding carriers at a measured, predictable rate. The shock of Pearl Harbor in December 1941 changed everything about naval warfare, but German observers did not immediately grasp the implications. Yes, carrier aircraft had struck a decisive blow against battleships in harbor, but this seemed to many German officers to be an opportunistic attack against unprepared defenses, not a fundamental shift in naval strategy. The Japanese had achieved surprise, nothing more. In a fleet engagement in the open ocean, battleships would still matter. Carriers would provide air cover and reconnaissance, but the decisive blows would come from heavy guns. Even as the war in the Pacific began to demonstrate the dominance of carrier aviation, German intelligence reports remained cautiously optimistic about German naval prospects. The Bismarck, before its loss in May 1941, had demonstrated that a well-designed battleship could still be a formidable threat. U-boats continued to sink Allied shipping at alarming rates throughout 1942. If Germany could weather the industrial storm, if the new generation of Type 21 U-boats could be deployed in sufficient numbers, if the Luftwaffe could maintain air superiority over the Atlantic approaches, then perhaps the war at sea could still be won. Within this context, the intelligence estimates about American carrier capacity made sense. 30 to 40 aircraft per carrier seemed reasonable. The Germans knew the Americans were building more carriers. Intelligence reports confirmed construction at multiple shipyards. But the assumption was that these new carriers would be similar in capability to existing vessels, perhaps slightly larger, perhaps slightly more efficient, but fundamentally comparable in aircraft capacity. This assumption was catastrophically wrong. The Essex-class carrier program, authorized by the United States Congress in 1942, represented an industrial commitment that German planners had not thought possible. These were not converted hulls or experimental designs. These were purpose-built fleet carriers constructed on assembly line principles, incorporating lessons learned from earlier carrier operations. And they were being built not in ones or twos, but in dozens. The first Essex-class carrier, USS Essex herself, was commissioned in December 1942. By the end of 1943, 5 more had joined the fleet. By the end of 1944, 17 Essex-class carriers were in commission. By the war's end, 24 would be completed, with 8 more under construction. But it was not merely the number of carriers that should have alarmed German intelligence. It was their individual capacity. An Essex-class carrier was 872 feet long, displaced 27,000 tons when empty and over 36,000 tons when fully loaded. The flight deck was over 800 feet long and 108 feet wide. Below that deck were multiple hangar bays, workshops, ammunition storage, fuel tanks, crew quarters, and all the support infrastructure needed to maintain and operate a floating airbase. And each one carried 90 aircraft. Not 30, not 40, 90. The mathematics of this capability were staggering. 17 Essex-class carriers in service by the end of 1944 meant 1,530 aircraft deliverable to any point in the Pacific where American naval power could reach. This number did not include the light carriers, the escort carriers, or the older fleet carriers that remained in service. This was the Essex-class alone. For comparison, the entire Luftwaffe had approximately 4,000 combat aircraft available on the Eastern Front in summer 1944. The combined might of Germany's Air Force, stretched across thousands of miles of front line, outnumbered the carrier-based naval aviation of the Essex-class alone by a ratio of less than 3 to 1. And those Luftwaffe aircraft had to contend with Soviet fighters, defend German cities against Allied bombing, support ground troops, and patrol coastal waters. The Essex carriers had one mission: project American power wherever the United States Navy chose to send them. Heinrich Müller did not know these numbers as he stood on the deck of the Shangri-La in May 1945. But he was beginning to understand them intuitively, viscerally, in a way that no intelligence report could have conveyed. The American lieutenant commander continued the tour, leading Müller below deck into the hangar bay. Here, the scale became even more overwhelming. The hangar stretched the length of the ship, a cavernous space lit by overhead lights. Aircraft were parked wing to wing, seemingly endless rows of them. Müller recognized some types from intelligence photographs: Grumman F-6F Hellcats, the stubby, powerful fighters that had decimated Japanese air power in the Pacific; Curtiss SB-2C Helldivers, the dive bombers; Grumman TBF Avengers, torpedo bombers larger than many land-based aircraft Germany had operated early in the war. "This is just one hangar bay," the American said. "We have another below this one, and we can park aircraft on the flight deck when we need to maximize capacity." Müller walked among the aircraft, noting details. The planes were not cramped together, barely fitting. There was space to work, space to move equipment, space to conduct maintenance. Each aircraft appeared well-maintained, painted in regulation colors, with no signs of shortage or improvisation. The tires were new, the propellers were polished, the canopies were clear and unscratched. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. "How long does it take to train a pilot?" Müller asked, still studying the rows of aircraft. The American officer considered the question. "For carrier operations? About 18 months from initial flight training to carrier qualified. Maybe a bit longer if they're going into fighters. The landing part is tricky. You've got to catch the wire on a moving deck, in weather, sometimes at night." 18 months. Müller did mental arithmetic he wished he didn't have to do. 90 aircraft per carrier meant 90 pilots minimum. 17 Essex-class carriers meant 1,530 pilots just for this one class of ship. And those pilots had to be replaced as they were lost to combat, accidents, or exhaustion. The training pipeline had to be enormous, continuous, always producing more pilots than were needed just to account for attrition. Germany had started the war with the best-trained pilots in the world. The Condor Legion veterans from Spain, men who had honed their skills in actual combat before the war even began, had formed the elite corps of the Luftwaffe. But by 1945, most of those men were dead. The training programs had been cut shorter and shorter as fuel grew scarce and the need for pilots grew desperate. A German fighter pilot in 1945 might have 40 hours of flight time before being sent into combat. 40 hours against American pilots with 18 months of training. The American led him deeper into the ship, down ladders and through narrow passages that opened into broader corridors. They passed crew quarters, mess halls, medical facilities. Müller had served on U-boats where men slept in shifts because there weren't enough bunks. He had known cruisers where the crew shared cramped spaces, where fresh water was rationed, where every cubic meter of space was precious. This carrier had a library. He saw it through an open hatch, actual books on actual shelves, comfortable chairs, men reading in off-duty hours. "How many crew?" Müller asked. "About 2,600 for the Essex-class," the American replied, "though it varies depending on the air group embarked and whether we're carrying extra personnel." 2,600 men on a single ship. The entire complement of U-boats that Müller had served with, across 3 years of war, might have totaled that number. And those U-boats had been the pride of the Kriegsmarine, the cutting edge of German naval technology, the weapon that was supposed to strangle Britain into submission. All those men, all those submarines, all that effort, And here was a single American ship that carried as many personnel as dozens of U-boats combined. They descended further, into the engineering spaces. Here the noise was tremendous. The deep thrumming of turbines, the rush of steam, the mechanical symphony of a ship's propulsion system operating at peacetime idle. The American officer had to raise his voice to be heard. 4 Westinghouse-geared turbines, he shouted. 150,000 shaft horsepower. Top speed is 33 knots, though we don't usually push her that hard unless we need to. 33 knots. Mueller had commanded U-boats that could make 17 knots on the surface, 7 submerged. This carrier, this massive floating city of 2,600 men and 90 aircraft, could outrun his submarine on the surface by nearly double. The tactical implications were crushing. A U-boat's greatest advantage had always been its ability to approach unseen, to strike, to disappear. But if the enemy could deploy aircraft from carriers that moved at 33 knots, that could be anywhere in vast oceanic spaces, that could search hundreds of square miles with radar-equipped patrol planes, what chance did a submarine have? The mathematics of detection were simple and brutal. A U-boat on the surface could be spotted by aircraft from perhaps 10 miles away in good conditions. An aircraft flying at 200 miles per hour could search 4,000 square miles in an hour. A carrier with 90 aircraft, even allowing for maintenance, rest periods, and reserve, could launch search patterns that made submarine operations in entire ocean regions impossible. Mueller had experienced this personally. In the spring of 1944, operating west of Ireland, his U-boat had been forced to dive 17 times in 1 week by patrolling aircraft. 17 times the lookouts had spotted distant specks in the sky and screamed warnings. 17 times the crew had tumbled below, sealed the hatches, and descended into the suffocating pressure of hiding beneath the waves. Each dive consumed battery power that could only be replenished by surfacing to run the diesel engines. Each dive interrupted the patrol, made the mission slower, more dangerous, more likely to fail. He had assumed, during those dives, that he was being hunted by land-based patrol aircraft. The British had bases in Iceland, in Northern Ireland, in Scotland. Long-range Liberators and Sunderland flying boats operated from those bases, searching for U-boats with increasing effectiveness. This was a known threat, one that could be planned around, avoided by staying away from land-based aircraft range. But if the Americans could deploy carriers with 90 aircraft each, if those carriers could operate anywhere in the Atlantic, if each carrier represented a mobile airbase that could project search patterns across thousands of square miles, then there was no safe water. No region beyond aircraft range, no operational zone where a U-boat could surface to charge batteries without risking detection. The American officer led him back up through the ship, toward the flight deck again. As they climbed ladders and walked through passages, Mueller noticed other details. The electrical systems were modern, well-maintained, with circuit breakers and cable runs that suggested abundant copper and skilled installation. The damage control equipment was readily accessible, with firefighting stations every few meters. The ventilation was good, no buildup of stale air, no sense of recycled atmosphere. Fresh water, he had been told, was distilled from seawater by the ship's evaporators. There was no rationing. They emerged onto the flight deck again, into the cold May air. The sun was higher now, burning off the morning mist. From the deck, Mueller could see other ships in the anchorage, destroyers, cruisers, another carrier in the distance. The American fleet at rest, casually displaying more naval power than Germany had possessed at the height of its strength. "Would you like to see the operations room?" the American asked. "Where we coordinate the air group during flight operations?" Mueller nodded. He was no longer certain what he wanted to see, but he felt compelled to understand the full scope of what he had missed, what German intelligence had failed to grasp. what his nation had been fighting against. The operations room was located in the island superstructure, the tall vertical structure that rose from the starboard side of the flight deck. Inside, it was cramped compared to the vast spaces below, but efficiently organized. Status boards covered the walls, showing aircraft assignments, maintenance schedules, pilot rosters. A large plotting table dominated the center of the room, currently covered with a chart of the Pacific that Mueller recognized from German naval maps. "During operations, we track every aircraft," the American explained. "Launch times, fuel states, mission parameters, recovery windows. When we're launching a full strike, say 70 aircraft, it has to be coordinated down to the minute. We can launch one aircraft every 30 seconds in good conditions. Recovery takes longer, but we can get the whole air group back aboard in under an hour if we push it." 70 aircraft launched in 35 minutes. Mueller tried to imagine the spectacle. The thunder of engines, the ballet of deck crews moving aircraft from hangar to catapult, the precisely timed launches that hurled 10-ton machines into the air one after another. He tried to imagine being on the receiving end of such a strike. 70 aircraft arriving over a target with bombs and torpedoes, fighter escorts flying high cover, the attack coordinated by radio from the carrier that launched them. German naval doctrine had emphasized the Bismarck model, the powerful surface raider escorted by destroyers operating independently to disrupt Allied shipping. The Bismarck had lasted 8 days before being hunted down and destroyed, 8 days from breakout to sinking. And the weapons that had crippled her, that had jammed her rudder and left her limping in circles while British battleships closed in, had been torpedoes from obsolete British swordfish biplanes, fabric-covered aircraft that looked like relics from the previous war but had proven devastatingly effective. If obsolete biplanes from small British carriers could cripple the Bismarck, what could 70 modern aircraft from an Essex-class carrier do? The question answered itself. "What's the range?" Mueller asked. "How far can your aircraft strike from the carrier?" The American officer smiled slightly, perhaps recognizing that this was the question that mattered most. "Depends on the aircraft and the mission profile. Hellcats have a combat radius of about 900 miles with external tanks. The torpedo bombers and dive bombers are shorter, maybe 300 miles for a strike mission with full ordnance, but we can extend that with aerial refueling if we really need to reach out." 900 miles. The number settled in Mueller's mind like a stone dropping into dark water. 900 miles meant that an Essex-class carrier operating east of Bermuda could strike targets on the European coast. 900 miles meant that no German port, no naval base, no coastal defense was safe from carrier attack if the Americans chose to bring their fleet into the eastern Atlantic. And they had 17 of these carriers, 17 with more being built, each one a mobile airbase, each one carrying 90 aircraft, each one capable of projecting American power 900 miles in any direction. The industrial capacity required to build even one such ship was staggering. The hull alone required thousands of tons of steel, shaped and welded into complex forms, armored in critical areas, compartmentalized to survive damage. The propulsion system was a masterwork of engineering. Turbines that could reliably produce 150,000 horsepower, hour after hour, day after day, through storms and combat operations. The aircraft elevators that lifted planes from hangar to flight deck were massive hydraulic systems, each capable of raising several tons of aircraft in seconds. The catapults that launched aircraft were precision mechanisms that had to reliably accelerate a 10-ton machine to flying speed in a few hundred feet, without breaking the airframe or killing the pilot. And then there were the aircraft themselves. 90 aircraft meant 90 engines, 90 sets of wings and control surfaces, 90 radios, 90 sets of instruments, 90 armament systems. Each aircraft required thousands of parts, each part manufactured to precise tolerances, each component tested and certified for the brutal environment of carrier operations. salt spray, violent catapult launches, arrested landings that subjected the airframe to forces that would destroy a poorly built plane. The ammunition storage held thousands of rounds of 50 caliber ammunition for the fighters, hundreds of bombs ranging from small anti-personnel weapons to 2,000-pound armor-piercing monsters, dozens of torpedoes, aerial mines, depth charges. The fuel tanks held hundreds of thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, properly stored and protected against fire and explosion. The spare parts inventory included replacement engines, propellers, landing gear assemblies, radios, instruments, everything needed to keep 90 aircraft operational even when far from shore facilities. And supporting all of this were 2,600 men, pilots and aircrew, mechanics and ordnance handlers, radar operators and radio technicians, cooks and doctors and administrative personnel. 2,600 men who had to be recruited, trained, fed, clothed, paid, and kept healthy and effective through months of operations at sea. The United States had built 17 of these carriers by the end of 1944. 17 separate construction projects, each requiring years of planning and months of building, each drawing on steel mills and engine factories and electronics manufacturers and shipyards. And this was just the Essex-class. The Americans had also built dozens of escort carriers, smaller, slower ships converted from merchant hulls, but still capable of operating aircraft for anti-submarine patrol and ground support. They had built light carriers based on cruiser hulls. They had maintained and upgraded their older fleet carriers from before the war. The German naval construction program, by comparison, had managed to complete exactly 0 aircraft carriers during the entire war. The Graf Zeppelin, laid down in 1936, had been launched in 1938 but never completed. Work had stopped and started multiple times as priorities shifted, as steel was diverted to U-boats and battleships, as the Luftwaffe refused to provide properly trained carrier pilots. By 1943, the ship was being used as a floating warehouse. She would be scuttled in 1945, never having sailed on a combat mission. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Muller walked to the edge of the flight deck and looked out at the anchorage. The wind had picked up, sending small whitecaps across the harbor water. He thought about the reports he had read, the intelligence assessments that had guided German naval strategy. 30 to 40 aircraft per carrier. That had been the estimate. Based on that estimate, planners had calculated threat levels, assigned resources, developed tactics. But the estimate had been wrong by more than half. Not slightly wrong, not off by 10% or 20%. Wrong by a factor of more than 2. And that error, multiplied across 17 ships, multiplied across years of war, had led to decisions that now seemed incomprehensible in their optimism. The U-boat campaign had been predicated on the assumption that submarines could sink Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. For a time, that assumption had seemed correct. In 1942, German U-boats had sunk more than 6 million tons of Allied shipping. The losses had been catastrophic, threatening Britain's ability to continue the war. But even as U-boats sent more and more ships to the bottom, American shipyards were building more and more Liberty ships, simple merchant vessels constructed on assembly line principles, launched faster than Germany could sink them. And protecting those Liberty ships were escort carriers, destroyers, destroyer escorts, patrol aircraft, all products of the same industrial system that had built 17 Essex-class carriers in 3 years. The same system that produced 50,000 combat aircraft in 1944 alone. The same system that manufactured tens of thousands of tanks, millions of trucks, billions of rounds of ammunition. Part 3. The American officer checked his watch. "I'm afraid we need to wrap up soon. Do you have any other questions?" Muller had 1,000 questions, but he was not certain he wanted the answers. "The pilot training," he said finally. "You mentioned 18 months. How many pilots are you training?" The American shrugged.
I don't have exact numbers, but the pipeline is pretty substantial. Naval Air Station Pensacola alone graduates hundreds of pilots every few months. There are other training stations, Corpus Christi, Jacksonville, several others. And that's just the Navy. The Army Air Forces has its own training command that's even bigger. Hundreds of pilots every few months from a single training station. Multiple training stations. Continuous production of trained aviators fed into the fleet, replacing losses, expanding capabilities, maintaining a pool of qualified pilots that ensured every carrier could operate at full capacity. Germany had started the war with approximately 1,000 trained fighter pilots in the Luftwaffe. By 1945, pilot training had been reduced to a desperate scramble, throwing teenagers into cockpits with minimal instruction, hoping they would survive long enough to learn. The fuel shortages meant training flights were cut short. The instructor pilots were increasingly being pulled back into combat units because there was no one else left to fly. The training aircraft themselves were often obsolete models that bore little resemblance to the high-performance fighters the students would eventually fly if they survived their first missions. "May I ask you something?" Muller said, choosing his words carefully. "Did your intelligence services know the extent of German carrier development, or lack thereof?" The American officer smiled slightly. "I think that's probably a question above my pay grade, Captain. But I can tell you that naval intelligence was pretty thorough. We knew the Graf Zeppelin was never finished. We knew about the conversion plans that never went anywhere. To be honest, after Midway, the focus was entirely on the Pacific. The Japanese had real carriers with experienced pilots, and that's where the carrier war was being fought."
Midway, June 1942. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in one day, along with their experienced air crew and maintenance personnel. The decisive carrier battle of the war fought before Germany had really understood what carrier warfare meant. The Japanese had learned the lesson in blood, losing the core of their carrier striking force in a single engagement. But Japan had at least entered the war with a carrier doctrine, with trained pilots, with ships designed for the mission. Germany had entered the war with battleship dreams and submarine theories, neither of which had accounted for the possibility that one nation could build 17 fleet carriers in 3 years, while simultaneously fighting a 2-ocean war, bombing Germany around the clock, supplying the Soviet Union with thousands of tanks and aircraft, feeding Britain, and developing an atomic bomb. The escort back to the dock was quiet. Muller thanked the American officer, who saluted with casual professionalism, and departed. Other German officers were gathering, other former enemies being
shown the physical evidence of their defeat. Muller recognized some faces: a submarine commander he had known briefly, a surface officer who had served on the Scharnhorst before she was sunk. They all had the same expression, a mixture of shock and reluctant comprehension. That evening, in the temporary quarters provided for German POWs awaiting repatriation, Muller sat down with a notepad and tried to reconstruct what he had learned. The numbers seemed almost abstract when written down. 90 aircraft per carrier, 17 carriers of the Essex-class alone, 1,530 aircraft, 2,600 crew per ship, 33 knot top speed, 900-mile combat radius. But behind the numbers were implications that reached far beyond naval warfare. The United States had not won the war through superior ideology or more fanatical determination or better generals. They had won through industrial capacity so overwhelming that it redefined what was possible in modern war. They had won by building more ships than could be sunk, more aircraft than could be shot down, more tanks than could be destroyed. They had won by training more pilots than could be killed, recruiting more soldiers than could be casualties, producing more ammunition than could be expended. The propaganda Muller had been fed throughout the war had acknowledged American industrial strength, but had suggested it was soft strength, civilian strength, the strength of a nation that made automobiles and refrigerators but could not apply that capacity to military ends with German efficiency. The propaganda had suggested that American soldiers were undisciplined, that American equipment was shoddy, that American resolve would crumble in the face of determined resistance. Standing on the deck of the Shangri-La, seeing 90 combat aircraft maintained to perfection, 2,600 crew members operating a floating city with casual competence, had shattered every piece of that propaganda. The Americans were not inefficient. They were not shoddy. They were not undisciplined. They had simply approached war as an industrial problem and solved it with industrial methods. Germany had approached war as a crusade, as a test of will, as a struggle for survival that would be won by superior soldiers fighting with superior equipment. And German soldiers had often been superior, man for man. German equipment had often been excellent. The Tiger tank, the Me-262 jet fighter, the Type 21 U-boat were all technically impressive machines. But excellence in individual systems meant nothing when the enemy could produce adequate systems in overwhelming numbers. One Essex-class carrier with 90 adequate aircraft would defeat the most technically sophisticated battleship ever designed. 17 Essex-class carriers with 1,500 adequate aircraft would defeat any fleet that could be assembled against them. The mathematics were simple and crushing. Muller thought
about the U-boats that had been sunk in 1944 and 45. Hundreds of them, sent to the bottom by patrol aircraft, escort carriers, hunter-killer groups. Each U-boat represented months of construction, trained crew, scarce materials. Each loss was irreplaceable. But for every U-boat sunk, the Allies built more escorts, trained more pilots, deployed more search radars, refined their tactics. The exchange rate was catastrophic. Germany lost submarines faster than they could be built. The Allies built escorts faster than submarines could sink them. And underlying everything was the industrial base. The steel mills of Pittsburgh and Gary, the shipyards of Philadelphia, Norfolk, Newport News, the aircraft factories in Buffalo, Dallas, Los Angeles, the training bases scattered across the American South and Southwest, the web of infrastructure, railroads, highways, power grids, communication networks that tied it all together and made it function. Germany had bombed British cities, hoping to break civilian morale and disrupt production. The results had been limited. Britain kept fighting, kept producing, absorbed the punishment, and continued. Then the Americans and British began bombing German cities with increasing accuracy and overwhelming numbers of aircraft. By 1944, German production was being carried out in dispersed facilities, hidden in forests, moved underground. The efficiency losses were enormous. But American production faced no such disruption. The factories ran 3 shifts, churning out ships and planes and tanks without interference. The workers were well-fed, well-paid, motivated by wages and patriotism. The raw materials flowed uninterrupted from mines and mills. The finished products were loaded onto trains and ships, transported to ports, loaded aboard vessels, and delivered to fighting fronts around the world. Muller had seen the logistical tail that supported one Essex-class carrier, the fuel tankers that provided thousands of gallons of oil and aviation gasoline, the ammunition ships that replenished bombs and torpedoes, the supply vessels that brought food, spare parts, mail, everything needed to keep the ship operational. An Essex-class carrier didn't operate alone. It operated as part of a task force that included cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and all the support vessels needed to keep the combat ships fighting. And there were 17 of them. 17 separate task forces, 17 separate concentrations of naval power, each one capable of projecting American influence anywhere the ocean reached. 17 symbols of industrial capacity that Germany had never possessed and could never match. The door to the quarters opened and another German officer entered. Kapitän-Leutnant Franz Weber, a U-boat commander Müller had known before the war. Weber looked exhausted. older than his 32 years. "Did they take you to see the carriers, too?" Weber asked. Muller nodded. "The Shangri-La."
I saw the Lexington, Weber said, sitting down heavily on one of the bunks. 90 aircraft. I counted them in the hangar bay because I didn't believe the American officer. I thought he was exaggerating, trying to impress us. But I counted them. 90. And they told me the Lexington was the 5th ship of the class. 5th.
They've built at least 20. 24 completed by the war's end, Muller said quietly. More under construction. Weber was silent for a moment. "We were told 30 aircraft per carrier. That's what the intelligence report said. 30, maybe 40 at most. The reports were wrong. The reports were lies," Weber said bitterly. "Or the intelligence officers were incompetent. Or both." Muller considered this. "I don't think it was lies or incompetence. I think it was underestimation. They knew the Americans were building carriers, but they assumed the Americans would build them the way we would have built them. They assumed limitations that didn't exist. They assumed the Americans would face the same resource constraints, the same labor shortages, the same industrial bottlenecks that we faced. But they didn't," Weber said. "No, they didn't." Outside, the sound of American machinery could be heard, trucks moving supplies, cranes loading cargo, the constant hum of activity that characterized American logistics. Even in victory, even with the war over, the machinery continued. The industrial system that had built 17 Essex-class carriers continued to function, producing, transporting, organizing. "What are you going to tell people when we get home?" Weber asked. "When they ask what we saw?" Muller thought about this carefully. "The truth. That we fought against an enemy whose industrial capacity we never understood. That our best efforts were inadequate not because German soldiers were cowards or German equipment was inferior, but because we were facing an opponent who could build faster than we could destroy, who could train faster than we could kill, who could replace every loss and then build more on top of that." "They won't believe it," Weber said. "The civilians at home, they think we lost because of betrayal, because of mistakes, because we weren't fanatical enough. They won't believe that we lost because the Americans could put 90 aircraft on a single carrier and build 24 of those carriers while fighting a two-ocean war." "Perhaps not," Muller agreed. "But it's the truth anyway." The two men sat in silence, contemplating the wreckage of their beliefs. Outside, the American machinery continued its work, indifferent to German comprehension or lack thereof. The war was over. The victors were already planning the peace, dividing the world into spheres of influence, establishing the institutions that would govern the post-war order. And at the heart of that order would be American power, American industry, American capacity. Years later, after Muller had returned to Germany, after he had tried to rebuild a life in a divided nation, he would occasionally see photographs of aircraft carriers in newspapers or magazines. The Americans continued building them, even larger classes after the Essex, supercarriers with nuclear propulsion, ships that dwarfed even the massive vessels that had impressed him so much in 1945. Each photograph would trigger the same memory, standing on the deck of the Shangri-La, hearing the number 90, feeling his entire understanding of the war shift and crack. The moment when abstractions became concrete, when intelligence estimates met physical reality, when the full scope of German defeat became impossible to deny. The Essex-class carriers that Muller toured would serve for decades after the war. Many were modernized, equipped with angled flight decks and steam catapults, serving in Korea, Vietnam, even into the 1970s. The last Essex-class carrier, USS Lexington, not the ship Weber had toured, but a sister ship that inherited the name after the original Lexington was sunk at Coral Sea, would serve as a training carrier until 1991, 46 years after being commissioned. 46 years.
The entire span of Muller's naval career, from entering the academy to retirement, could have fit into the service life of one American carrier. The ship he had toured in May 1945, marveling at its size and capacity,
would still be operational when men walked on the moon, when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Soviet Union collapsed. The industrial system that had produced that ship, that had built 17 of them in 3 years during wartime, had established an American dominance that would last generations. Not because Americans were better sailors or braver pilots, though many were both, but because America had approached war as a problem of production, logistics, and industrial capacity, and had solved that problem with overwhelming effectiveness. Standing on the deck of the Shangri-La, Heinrich Müller had grasped this truth in a single terrible moment of clarity. 90 aircraft on one carrier, 17 carriers, 1,500 aircraft. The numbers that changed everything. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.